what's up? It's VJ once again. Welcome to the Headspace. We're talking another important topic, another important artist, SA hip hop all the time, 24/7. GOAT series, a continuation. I want to talk about an artist who has, for me, defined being adjacent to the common thread, being able to forge your own niche and define greatness, because this is what we're talking about, in your own context. If you've been following the Headspace, you know that we have 5 principles, and these 5 principles apply to each and every hip-hop artist we review, we talk about, we engage on. These are kind of our standard molding ground for what we consider to be the most important ways of measuring the impact of the art that hip-hop artists produce. So without any further ado, I want to talk about the brother whose recent album I gave a 10 out of 10. And it's only been my first 10 out of 10, and a lot of people were crying bias, but I really want to set up a space for the argument of saying,
En as hy nog nie redig weet wie's ek nie. Die naam is Jitsvinger, die man in die middel, die gaat op die wibbel te swam tussen die basje op binneste. En dit is 'n voorreg om vir julle te perform hier. Yes, full house. Baie dankie. Baie
Quentin Goliath, the Afrikaans ambassador, the most severely talented Afrikaans lyricist, might be the greatest of all time. What am I talking about? First and foremost, Quentin Goliath, born in Mitchell's Plain, grew up in Kales River. So this is the milieu of a lot of the township experiences that we all go through. But one thing that I feel makes it fundamentally different is that South Africa has a unique racial, let's call it a dichotomy, a separation. South Africa is a country where you could be black and you could be colored, and those don't mean the same thing. It's weird. South Africa is a country where you could be signing a form and it says, are you white? Are you Indian? Are you black? Are you African? And are you colored? There's a subtle contradiction, there's a subtle white supremacist urge to separate quote-unquote colored people from the idea of blackness. And I want to talk about that. And you might be on some VJ, what the hell does that have to do with hip-hop? Be patient with me. Hip-hop comes out of the racial construct. It comes from oppressed people who, because of their downtrodden experience, responded by creating an art form that was one of the only few ways that they could empower themselves. Kids bringing out cardboard boxes to move their bodies in ways that nobody had ever seen before. Talented young boys and girls taking old microphones and sound systems to express their inner poetry and, to be honest, just throw parties to deal with the struggle of black life, the struggle of white supremacist power on top of a people who never asked to be black. So that's my first thing right there. Blackness is something that was imposed on people. It isn't inherent. You might be thinking to yourself, if you refer to yourself as black, that it is what you are. But really, it is what you were called. You come from ethnic lines, you come from cultural lines, whether Umzulu, Umxhosa, Umtswana, whatever. People migrate through these cultural lanes, and blackness was a way that white supremacists labeled all people who were outside of the framework of European power. Now, with that being said, then why create a separate designation up in Mzansi for people who are clearly part of the African diaspora, the African movement, and call them colored? Long story cut short, this has to do a lot with setting people against each other. Setting people who go through the same experiences against each other. This is the classic divide and conquer strategy. And I'm talking about this because the lingering sense of divide and conquer still lives with us as South Africans in our day-to-day present moment. Colored people, quote unquote, have been one of the most foremost active participants of the hip-hop culture. They were the first to rock real hip-hop sneakers. They were the first to really embellish themselves in that kind of Afro-American influenced lifestyle when we were busy being amapanzula. So with that being said, how can, in the era of South African hip-hop's rise, the only real significant impact that we could say a colored artist ever made would be POC and AKA. In the midst of so many artists who've been active. I'm not even talking about youngster CPT. I'm talking about the resilient anti-blackness which exists inside of the people who call themselves colored, because they themselves were institutionalized to not see themselves as black. And I'm talking about black people who look at colored people as a separate phenomenon. And what I'm trying to say in a nutshell is that these labels, black, colored, they were all enforced upon us. And the most important thing is culture. Blackness is not necessarily culture. It's an experience of oppression. Your culture is what you find power in. So you might redefine your blackness as a sense of power in kind of the message of Steve Biko. So somebody like Jitsvinger's music is a deliberate political mission to educate. Here's an artist who from the get-go with his album Skeleton Key was able to reveal to us the experience of the Kapsa movement, the experience of young black/colored people living in a construct where they have to deal with their own inner conflict of whether or not they fit into blackness and whether or not their colored identity defines them as a marginalized group. He deals with this language, this problematic so-called language, Afrikaans. Now, what I could say about Afrikaans in a nutshell is that people forget that the term Afrikaans literally means African. It's Dutch for African. I mean, it doesn't get any simpler than that. These are people whose experiences revolve around this land, this continent, and whether we're trying to segment them because of European heritage, the fact still stands that if Africanness is anything, it's belonging to this land and it's understanding the power of nature and how to restore ourselves as people and empower ourselves using the power of the land. Africa is kind of like a greater metaphor for this political power of aligning with the balance of nature. So if you want to talk about Afrikaans, it is very much an authentic African language. It's an African experience. And if you go into the origins of Afrikaans, it was actually started by the so-called people who called the Khoi. So this lineage, this very bright, vigilant lineage that Jitsvinger comes from, is something that South Africa hasn't addressed because of this black-colored dichotomy. And I feel Jits' importance lies in the fact that as an artist, he's been able to, one, stand out as an original MC, creating a style that is influenced by the multi-syllable layers, the double entendres of New York rap, the easygoing flows of West Coast hip-hop and Southern hip-hop and Midwest hip-hop, and put them into the context of South Africa. And number two, this guy emphasizes the power of our slang, our language. So we're talking about authenticity. And number three, this guy has been able to, the catalog of his musicianship, become so consistent from building Skeleton Key, from moving on and giving us his mixtape, and from giving us this incredible album. Jits has had a streak that you might question me here and say, well, Vijay, we don't see a lot of this guy on TV. We don't see a lot of this guy. We don't hear a lot of this guy on radio. So what gives us, what gives you the kind of valid opinion to say that he could be a great? Jitsvinger is a thespian, people. He's involved in theater, he plays guitar.
Hey, ik breek je silence met een 10-pound mic en als ik swing en combine het met een speakerbox. Vibes gaat ik stie, of ik alle frequentie top van mijn 3 minuten zorgen dat het ziet zonder grondwater.
He's toured Europe. So if I were to tweak or even address the issue of mass appeal, let's ask the question, when we're talking mass appeal, does global impact really trump local impact? because Jitsvinger is known across the world. Jitsvinger is an artist that has toured with actors and rappers alike. He's done collaborations with Dutch, Swedish MCs. He's been around hip-hop movements around the world. So by definition, he's a universal, global hip-hop scholar and artist. Does it matter that most South Africans don't know him? I'm putting it out there. It's a question mark. And it's a question mark that has us on a vein of thinking whether or not South Africa truly allows its accomplished artists to be acknowledged at home. You know, one of my most resilient Bible scriptures was, a prophet is not acknowledged in his own home, or something like that. And maybe Jitsvinger is yet another example of that. Yet another example of how sometimes where you come from is not necessarily where you are celebrated. Sometimes it takes you going out to the world and talking about your story in a way that it transcends the local boundaries. It teaches people from across cultures of this one singular human experience. Maybe that's the way for people back home to start noticing you. I don't know. I'm putting it out there. But as far as Jitsvinger's accomplishment as an artist goes, he has created a formidable resume of being a global artist. He has had a consistent album run. He has had one of the most original rapping styles continuously develop. He has been able to dangle between new wave, yet become consistently boom bap, yet engineer a sound that is like totally him and doesn't seek to be anybody else. So ultimately, if you were to look at it, if you were to look at a guy who's toured the world, maintained his game and his style, being able to stretch across different pockets in the hip-hop movement, still one of the most savage lyricists that exist. And the only thing that we might really put against him is the fact that Abem Zanta Smaz. Do you think that's enough to not warrant somebody a GOAT? Especially taking into consideration that we might not know him, but the rest of the world does. And that's what I want to kind of start with this conversation, is what's more important, global appreciation or local acknowledgement?
Mijn mic tape blazen heel dik, survival Davies. Ik zal er komen tot laat toe met de aardvorm. Poplappen kom bij elkaar, maak los wat vast is. Als zij float als jouw zaak, je mij naar elkaar die ook aan die fout maken. Oh, en slapen die kids en ik provide in die vies. Laat die mic met een 4, 5, 6. Likkie van het op haar af, intersepiso's. Ja, ik steek flows, dat hoeft er op elkaar. Klaar gezegd, doe het zoals ik aan liefde doe. Come on now. Energy level is goed, laat het koeken die kinderen.
Now I think in order to understand any MC's modus operandi, which is like fancy English for mission, we've got to understand their rap name. Rap names are a way that MCs capture their spirit. It's our superhero names. It's how people save themselves and through their art and their music are possibly able to save other people. Now Quentin Goliath, excuse me, that's the comedian, right? Quentin Goliath is having a talk with his cousin. His cousin shares this funny anecdote with him about a guy who climbed over some live wire and happened to shock himself, and he put it in the Afrikaans sense and said, he shock himself dot juts. Now that word juts stuck to the dude, and Quentin thought to himself, yo, that's a nice little interesting slang term, and he brought it back to his hood. But it endeared with him the fact that jits, the power of language, shock. And basically, in a nutshell, what Quentin Goliath's aim is to be that electrifying tingle in your fingers through his art. And he also strives to be that source of power that is able to electrify South Africa's music scene, electrify people's lives. Shock, maybe in shock value, maybe in shock power, maybe it implies a sense of awe and a sense of wisdom and a sense of profundity and a sense of reflection in the same sense, because, you know, electricity is power, it's magnetism. And I feel like through a name like Jitsvinger, he sums up his whole mission, and he's remained so consistent in this through his catalog. Whether we're talking about his first album, Skeetel Sleetel, and going into the mixtape Jitsvinger and going into what is possibly one of the greatest South African hip-hop albums of all time, Jits Nova Volume 1. What Jits has been able to do is mark, create, and outline his own lane. And I know this is difficult for a lot of artists to do and believe in an era where we feel like we need to belong to a greater group, a greater subgroup. Yeah, Jits belongs to the Afrikaans MC bracket, but he's very much outlining for himself something unique, communicating to his particular audience and doing it in a way where he's diverse enough as an instrumentalist, playing his guitar, as a thespian, going out there and performing, doing his poetry, being able to weave all of that around hip-hop and MCing, thus getting him out into the world. So the final question I have for y'all as the subscribers, as our headspaces, is this, and this is one I want us to really kind of chew on, is the fact that when we take into consideration the 5 principles, Jitsvinger obviously takes into consideration the aspect of originality, the aspect of consistency, the aspect of technicality, the aspect of mass appeal in a certain context, the aspect of emotional depth. The question then becomes, how will we be able to kind of undermine that value? Many would say his mass appeal might be global, but it isn't local. So I want to tie that in to how culture is an ever-evolving dynamic. We tend to identify ourselves with culture as if it was a barrier. Ndingumxhosa, ndingumpona, ndingumthembu, ndingumsuthu. And whenever we do this, we emphasize the differences more than the similarities. And yet, in our Suthu-ness, in our Xhosa-ness, we have taken up Europeanisms, Americanisms, hip-hopisms, jazzisms, rockisms, whatever you want to call them. The human experience is unable to be trapped in boxes, and I think what artists like Jitsvinger represent is that through his heritage as a quote-unquote colored person, he represents to us the fact that you can't call somebody mixed race, because humanity is not a masala. We are an ever-diversifying variation. So, kakate, essentially, we are different, and we are merging continuously, and we are learning from each other. So, to say mixed race, to focus on yourself as a kind of combination of different things, is to an extent to deny the fact that it's all one experience in varying forms, and that race even itself is a very thin construct. Jitsvinger is an MC who's here to teach us about race theory, who's here to teach us about the dynamics of difference, unity, diversity, and variation. And if I were to look at the culture and the heritage and the tradition of MCs who've done it, Apim Zanzi, man, I definitely put him in the testament of people who have been the most important. And then you want to say, but VJ, I thought mass appeal was supposed to be local. That's why I gotta say Jitsvinger might be the GOAT. And that might is based on how you view mass appeal. So maybe this next episode is a carry-on on the capacity of mass appeal and whether or not in thinking local in order to act global, which one takes higher precedence? Do you start at home in order to reach the world, or do you reach the world in order to be appreciated at home? Is it an either or? Can you do both at the same time? These are the questions. Right now I don't have the answers, we're putting it out there. All I do know is that, god damn it, Quentin Goliath Jitsvinger might just be the greatest of all time. We got a link to his current album. Check it out. Check his music out. Be part of the conversation. Thank you for always entertaining these rants and these informative subject dialogues. Hip-hop is our life. We live this culture, this South African hip-hop, and we're writing our history one episode at a time. It's the Headspace. Kamalam Viwe Joka, VJ, your brother from the ancient mother. It's been another beautiful one. Shout out to Jitsvinger. Get at me! Jits is not the code. Why the F not?
Jitsvinger. Yo, let's go. Op die connect soos 'n hopper slegs bompot sitte. Onafhepers weke. Jong verse, geskets met potlood en penne. En lokkie westers, so soort skirts en ditte. Kop toeskit op 'n tensin, blokkie exit, los die setlist. Ons sonnet sit die mond se tekste, as 'n opera in die bekste. Ek gee jou nog van die beste, as jy te veel nie, ons maak werk, moenie speel nie, ons floppe skitte met geselskap. Die wat mompel kry op Belpad, hier's 'n veelbrand vir jou konsens. Hoor 'n skat is 'n propsing met oorgeslat en befondsing. Lees 'n voorblad opskrif, fiasco met die music, gejak in 'n flow, lees 'n taxi of two-piece. In my grasies broeds, ek maak moves, soos liquor license gepeskaf deur die police. Koppel weet die wat luister, bly betrokke op hoe die grond soos hommeltuig opsil. Sonder volke, die se promise, die se 100 woord, die selle soos papier op gefrommeld sy.